Coming up on Network Africa, Ethiopia holds delayed elections in 3 regions of the country. Human Rights Watch says young boys drafted by jihadists in Mozambique. Plus, the World Health Organization says over 70% of African states miss their COVID-19 jabs target. Hello and a warm welcome to the program. I'm Layo Adegoke. We begin in Ethiopia, where the government has ordered the expulsion of 7 senior United Nations officials from the country for meddling in its internal affairs. The 7, who include individuals from the United Nations Children's Fund UNICEF and the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, have been declared persona non grata and given 72 hours to leave the country. Well, that's according to a statement by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. State-affiliated news agency FANA said Grant Eati, Deputy Humanitarian Coordinator for OCHA, and Adele Kodor, the UNICEF rep in Ethiopia, were among those expelled. Meanwhile, more than 7 million people in 3 Ethiopian regions are voting in elections delayed from June. The polls in Somali, Southern Nations and Harare regions were postponed after reports of irregularities and involvement of governing party officials in the process. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed will form the next government regardless of the results. His party already won 410 of the 436 parliamentary seats that were contested in the June vote. Prime Minister Abiy is under increasing international pressure over the war in the northern region of Tigray, where elections did not hold. Conflict broke out in November 2020, pitting federal and allied regional forces against forces aligned with the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, which clawed back control of Tigray after months of bloody battles in June. And speaking of the conflict in Tigray, according to the United Nations Emergency Relief Coordinator, after 11 months of conflict and 3 months of de facto blockade, the humanitarian crisis in the region is spiraling out of control. Martin Griffiths calls on the country's incoming new government to lead the country away from the abyss that it's staring into.
On Ethiopia, the UN's Emergency Relief Coordinator, Martin Griffiths, said that after 11 months of conflict and 3 months of de facto blockades, the humanitarian crisis in Tigray is spiraling out of control. He said that 5.2 million people still require food aid, with 400,000 people living in famine-like conditions. Our humanitarian colleagues say that child malnutrition is at the same level that at the outset of the 2011 Somalia famine. Mr. Griffiths warned it is likely to get far worse before it gets better, pointing to desert locusts, a potential poor harvest, humanitarian aid not getting through, and conflict spreading into neighboring regions of Amhara and Afar. Our humanitarian colleagues inform us that the delivery of aid, including fuel into Tigray, is still a challenge. In the past weeks, 79 trucks carrying aid arrived in Tigray via the Samala-Abala-Mekele corridor. This brings the total number of humanitarian trucks that have entered Tigray since July 12th to 606. I think, as we've said many times, what we need is 100 trucks to enter Tigray every day. So we're way below that target. Trucks carrying fuel and medical supplies still cannot enter Tigray. Trucks are waiting in Samara, in Afar, to travel to Mekele. Mr. Griffiths said he continues to engage with the government of Ethiopia to advocate for the easing of these blockade-like conditions and to allow for sustained and regular access to aid convoys. Commercial supplies have also been blocked since the end of June, causing severe shortages of essential commodities and a sharp rise in prices. For example, the price of cooking oil has increased by 400%, salt by 300%, and rice by 100%. Humanitarian partners are continuing to respond to urgent needs in the area, but facing the depletion of stocks and resources.
Away from Ethiopia now, Human Rights Watch HRW says a jihadist group in northern Mozambique has been kidnapping boys, some as young as the age of 12, and forcing them to fight against government troops. It says parents in the town of Palma in Cabo Delgado province reported seeing their sons wielding guns when they returned with other fighters to carry out raids. The HRW describes the growing use of children as fighters as the latest horrifying chapter in the violence in Cabo Delgado. Militants linked to the Islamic State group have been attacking villages and towns since 2017. Several southern African countries, as well as Rwanda, have deployed their troops to support the Mozambican military. Well, for more on this story, we're now being joined by security analyst Mr. Chidi Nwono. Thank you so much for speaking to us on the program. Now, it's not new news that children are being targeted by insurgents in Mozambique. But with this kind of reports of kidnapping and forcing children to fight against government forces, what can the government really do about this?
Good evening, and thank you for having me on. I think this is, as you said, it's not something new and it's not something unique, particularly in African conflicts, the use of child soldiers. For the insurgents, it's a very cheap resource. It's children are very easy to manipulate, to get to do things. You know, they'll work essentially for food. They haven't necessarily developed, you know, the instincts to fight back, and they're expendable. So looking from the insurgents' point of view, this makes a lot of sense. This is expendable and cheap manpower for them. However, from the government's point of view, these are Mozambican citizens and people that they're meant to be protecting. So I think the key impetus here is to look at the areas, look at the local surroundings, and try and understand where are these children coming from. Are they being abducted? Are they being volunteered? Are they joining of their own volition? Are they being recruited? And then trying to stem that tide and trying to cut the supply lines of these children. So if they are local children, then, you know, identifying their parents or their wards, and then diverting them away from the insurgents' recruiting pipeline.
Well, we know southern African countries have come together to help Mozambique. Rwandan President Paul Kagame, you know, over the weekend, he visited the northern province of Cabo Delgado, and he was reaffirming the importance of collaboration between both countries. Well, in your analysis, how helpful has this collaboration been, you know, in the fight against the insurgents?
Well, the Rwandans have been decisive in terms of turning around the conflict. So we have to be very clear that this is only the first stage. In an insurgency, if we look at the Maoist principles of guerrilla warfare, it's quite straightforward. When the friendly forces or when the dominant government forces are strong, the insurgents will generally fall back or retreat, and then, you know, resort to guerrilla attacks, you know, using IEDs, ambushing and things like that. When the dominant forces, the government forces are weak, these guerrillas will then attack, launch major attacks, do what they were doing before, taking towns. So we've got to be very clear that the Rwandans have had extremely, you know, critical success in taking back territory, defeating the insurgents. But what's very important is the next stage, is the stabilization and build stage, as it were. So they've cleared the areas. Now they need to hold the areas and they need to build. And that's where it's going to be crucial. And what you're going to need is a significant amount of manpower. So what you'll most likely see is that the Rwandans are acting as shock troops, able to go out there, take the fight to the enemy, defeat the enemy. And then now to be contingent upon the Mozambicans and possibly the other SADC troops to hold that ground and prevent the insurgents from re-infiltrating these areas. So the next few days, weeks are critical of how the insurgents react and then how the counter-insurgent forces or the government forces and their allies are able to suppress them.
Well, still speaking of Rwanda, some analysts have actually said, you know, the country is playing a game way above its weight in this and should instead be focusing on its traditional security concerns like the Democratic Republic of Congo and Uganda. Do you agree with this?
It's an interesting analysis. I don't think Rwanda has ever not punched above its weight. It's, you know, if you forgive the colloquialism, you know, the Rwandans have always had longer throats. You know, their They had no fear in taking on the DRC. So the Ugandans. So I don't think that them stepping into Mozambique is beyond their intentions. What's different is that this is out of their region, so they're now stepping into what would be South Africa's territory. But we've seen that South Africa doesn't necessarily have the political will or even the capacity to take on this task that the Rwandans have taken. Now, the Rwandans have said that their operations have been quite costly, meaning they've most likely taken quite significant casualties. It's unclear if the South Africans, Namibians, Botswanans, who all have good, capable forces, will be willing to accept the level of casualties that the Rwandans maybe are willing to accept. So whilst the South Africans and the other Southern African powers might not be happy about the Rwandans taking on this role, they are still doing a vital job. So again, as I said, everything falls on how the next few steps play out.
All right, then. Thank you so much. Chidi Warner, security analyst. Thank you for speaking to us on the program.
Thanks for having me.
The United Nations says summary killings in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo soared in August, driven by armed groups but also security forces. In a new conference in the DRC's capital, Kinshasa, the UN peacekeeping mission MONUSCO revealed that 739 cases of breach of human rights were recorded last month, compared with 492 in July. Now, these resulted in the deaths of at least 293 civilians, including 63 women and 24 children, according to the estimate compiled by the UN Joint Human Rights Office in the DRC. 94% of the documented cases in August occurred in the troubled North Kivu and Ituri provinces. Well, in West Africa, 5 Burkina-based soldiers have been killed in the north of the country when their vehicle ran over an improvised explosive device. One more soldier was wounded during the reconnaissance mission. The army says it immediately mobilized ground and air reinforcements to evacuate the victims and carry out security operations in Mentao, where the attack occurred. 6 members of the security forces were recently killed in eastern Burkina Faso while escorting fuel tanks for a mining company. About 2,000 people have been killed in similar attacks, often attributed to Al-Qaeda and other militant groups. Away from security matters, the World Health Organization says only 14 out of Africa's 54 countries have met the global target of vaccinating more than 10% of their populations against coronavirus by the end of September. Well, that's largely because COVAX, the mechanism set up to distribute vaccine doses to poor nations, has not been able to get enough doses. Seychelles, Mauritius and Morocco have achieved the highest vaccination rates, all above 40%. The WHO attributes this to their robust vaccination programs, as well as the size of the countries and their populations. Others which have met the target are Tunisia, Eswatini, Cape Verde, Botswana, Comoros, Zimbabwe, Equatorial Guinea, South Africa, Mauritania, Lesotho and Rwanda. But overall, just 4% of Africans have been fully jabbed, compared with 60% in the European Union. Somalia's first public oxygen plant has been opened by Somalia's Minister of Health and Turkey's ambassador to Somalia. It's a shot of hope for a country where a life-saving treatment for the coronavirus has been largely unavailable to patients during the pandemic.
The new plant in Mogadishu was purchased for €282,000 from Turkey by the Hormuz Salam Foundation, established by the country's largest telecoms company, Hormuz. The foundation also paid to repair the COVID wing it had set up by the hospital, where it's installing the oxygen plant. The wing in the hospital's outer wall was partially destroyed during an attack in July nearby by Islamist al-Shabaab militants who are fighting to overthrow the government.
The great public of the Somali will reach the medical oxygen much quicker. And the government of the Somali Minister of Health already bought another system, a second system, and that system will be ready end of October or the first week of November.
Other countries, such as India, suffered severe oxygen shortages during surges of COVID-19 infections, forcing desperate families of patients to pay exorbitant prices for cylinders. Oxygen will be distributed amongst the public hospitals in Somalia's capital, Mogadishu, for free of charge treatment.
There was a few private oxygen plants in the town who were actually selling the oxygen for business. So, and actually they were selling a normal price, $50 US, but in sometimes the price goes up and reaches.
As of Wednesday, Somalia had reported nearly 20,000 COVID-19 cases and 1,100 deaths, according to the World Health Organization. But figures could be far higher due to inadequate testing and unreported deaths. Only 1% of Somalia's 15 million citizens are fully vaccinated, reflecting inequities in vaccine distribution that the World Health Organization warns will prolong the pandemic, which has already claimed nearly 5 million lives.
Still ahead on the program. African youth climate activists tell world leaders to do more ahead of COP26. That's in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back to the program. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has defended former Health Minister Zweli Mkhize despite corruption allegations against him, which he has also denied. Mr. Ramaphosa says the ex-minister had served the nation well, citing his contribution to the health sector, especially his role in addressing the COVID-19 pandemic. He also asked South Africans to be more considerate. An investigation by the country's Special Investigating Unit found Dr. Mkhize guilty of a lack of oversight in the scandal involving the awarding of a $10 million COVID-19 communication contract. Money from the deal was used to buy Dr. Mkhize's son a car, and he was also given around $20,000, the probe found. However, he has denied any wrongdoing. Over in Malawi, a high-ranking former member of parliament, Clement Chiwaya, has shot himself dead in an office in parliament. Mr. Chiwaya, who had been using a wheelchair since he contracted polio at the age of 2, served as deputy speaker between 2014 and 2019. In a note he left before he went to parliament in Lilongwe, he wrote about the dispute he had with parliamentary officials over the ownership of a specially adapted vehicle. Well, local media is reporting that he entered the office of the Clerk of Parliament and shot himself with the clerk watching. Mr. Chiwaya, who was born in 1971, became a disability rights activist and successfully ran as a member of parliament 3 times. Police are now investigating how he was able to enter parliament, which is usually under heavy security, with a loaded pistol. The Speaker's office said that security officials thought that it was his wheelchair that triggered the metal detectors. An EU court has declared that EU-Morocco trade deals covering farm products and fish were invalid because they were agreed without the consent of the people of a disputed Northwest African territory. Morocco controls most of Western Sahara and considers it part of its territory after having fought a 16-year war with the Polisario Front independence movement, which had established the self-declared Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic there. The United Nations says the region, administered until 1976 by Spain, has a right to self-determination, and campaigners have sought to challenge the EU's trade deals with Morocco in the courts because they include the desert region. The Polisario Front, which says it acts on behalf of the Sahrawi people, challenged 2 EU-Morocco agreements struck in 2019, both revised after a previous EU court ruling that they were not applicable to Western Sahara. The revisions added the territory and its adjacent waters. Over in Kenya, the Interior Ministry has ordered the suspension of a visa-free transit agreement with Pakistan. This is after concerns were raised about an influx of groups of foreigners. Many of them were said to have come from Asia and had been spotted in residential areas in Nairobi. Numbers shared by the ministry showed that more than 20,000 people from Pakistan had entered the country since June. About 8,000 of them have since left. The Interior Ministry's principal Affairs Secretary Karanja Kibicho said the foreigners were on transit to Saudi Arabia for work. Saudi Arabia has put several Asian countries on its red list, which is designed to prevent the spread of coronavirus. Mr. Kibicho says Kenya was, however, alarmed by the threat of further spread of COVID-19 and would now restrict the number of people transiting through the country. A delegation led by UK COP26 envoy Mr. John Merton is in South Africa to meet with different cabinet ministers to discuss a climate deal that could channel almost 76 billion rand towards ending the country's dependence on coal. Now, this is in line with the country's just transition to a low-carbon economy and climate-resilient society, a few weeks ahead of the COP26, which will be held in Glasgow, Scotland. President Cyril Ramaphosa has welcomed this.
We are prepared as a country to adapt and to mitigate, but we are also saying that as we make our own commitments, there needs to be a fair amount of support. And we want those countries from more developed economies who caused such damage to the environment to live up to the commitments and the promises that they made through the various COP conferences that have been held. And we're looking forward to going to COP26. We will go there and make our own commitments, which are very strong and ambitious, which have been discussed with our private sector. But out of that determination that we are going to make, we want support in as far as funding is concerned. There needs to be grant funding, and the grant funding will assist us to be able to transition. And we need a just transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. So they must be able to put grant funding on the table. We also are saying that we want preferential concessionary funding. There must be a clear commitment on the funding that will be made available so that we are able to adapt, so that we are able to recalibrate our own various energy generation systems. We are ready. We are ready to adapt more to renewable energy, but the more developed economies need to come to the party, as it were, and give that funding. It's estimated that Sub-Saharan Africa, a number of countries will require $240 billion of funding. So we expect that the more developed economies will live up to their promises, and that if we get the funding, we will then be able to migrate and transition much more easily and quicker to renewable energy.
A selected group of youth climate activists, many from Africa, are taking part in talks along with environment ministers and policymakers to set out a framework for the COP26 summit in November. The activists are very clear about what they want. They demand to be part of the decision-making process on how to deal with the effects of climate change, and they want to see more concrete action.
Africa generates about 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions, the lowest of any continent. But scientists say it's most likely to be affected by climate change. According to the Center for Research on the Epidemiology of Disasters, in 2019, Africa recorded 56 extreme weather events compared to 45 in the previous year. These young Africans, part of about 400 young climate activists from around the world, have been chosen to sit down with decision makers in Italy to hammer out proposals for possible solutions to the world's climate crisis. 26-year-old Elizabeth Watuti is from Kenya.
One of my hopes and expectations from COP26 is that we will begin to see more action and less of promises, pledges and commitments of what is to be done. because the gap between our words and actions keep widening each and every day. In addition to stopping the emissions and investments in fossil fuels, we also need to massively invest in nature regeneration and also make sure that we are keeping all our ecosystems intact, because this is really critical when it comes to addressing the climate and ecological crisis. And I would hope that this is going to be one of the key conversations at COP26 on what is actually changing right now.
27-year-old Jeremy Ragowine from the Seychelles is calling for more financing for smaller states.
What I expect from COP26 is for greater access to financing for small island developing states like the Seychelles. Every day, every second that it's taken that doesn't allow for this such a finance allows people like myself to suffer.
The young activists accuse the world's leaders of too much talking and not enough action. They're calling on the world leaders who will gather in Glasgow in November for COP26 to listen to their words.
My message to the leaders is that we must act up and begin to be more responsible in terms of how we leave this planet for the next generations, because the future is at stake. We are worried, but we don't have to if you begin to take the right actions urgently.
Kenya and Somalia are suffering from drought this year after weak rainfall in late 2018 was followed by a major cyclone further south that pulled moisture away from the Horn of Africa. In Mozambique, 2 cyclones killed more than 600 people earlier this year. Extreme flooding has also affected more than 2 million people in Mozambique, Zimbabwe and Malawi. As scientists warn of the climate crisis, all eyes are now on the COP26. The conference aims to secure more ambitious climate action from the nearly 200 countries that signed the 2015 Paris Agreement and agreed to try to limit human-caused global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius.
And that's it on the program for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Layo Adebuki.